I had a lot to cover today. Congressman Dan Crenshaw is coming along, Matt Continetti and Ben Domenech, Jim Garrity here for the Week in Review. We've got Tarzana Joe and Jim Talent, regulars. Of course, the Hillsdale Dialogue. There's a lot today. I'm opening, though, with a trouble of mine that is actually really low on the hierarchy of troubles. It's an irritant, but it could be much higher for other people. So I begin by telling you where I'm going to end. Flee Fidelity investments. Simply flee them. Run. Now I will explain first the hierarchy of troubles. The lowest kind of trouble is worry. Generalized anxiety about something, whether or not rational. I worry about these teenagers I see rolling around on their bikes at 30 to 40 miles an hour doing wheelies in parking lots of shopping centers. I worry for them. I don't want to hit them. I don't want anyone to hit them. I went through a parking lot yesterday that is one of their notorious runways, and there was a fire truck, and I thought, oh my God, one of the kids got hit. That's a worry. That's very low down on the higher. It's not trouble at all. It's just anxiety. Secondly, there's irritants or annoyances. That's what I have with Fidelity, an irritant and an annoyance. And I've ended it. I've gotten rid of it, but I'm going to tell you about why. It could become an actual much higher on the level of trouble. Third level up from the bottom, problems. Lots of people have problems. I currently do not have any problems. Problems typically, most obviously, illness. Chronic or acute, that's pretty obviously a problem when you're sick. Or your family member or a friend or a loved one is sick. That's a problem. And there are usually problems in every life. I've had them. I expect there will be more in my life, but you deal with them. Then there are crises. And I've had a couple of those over the years. They can be personal. They can be in your family. Could be an illness, for example, that spirals into something that looks like it could end very badly. And I don't have any crises. And then there's tragedy. We saw tragedy 2 days ago in Washington, D.C. That's a crisis that has gone to a level that cannot be remedied. All you can do is grieve and mourn and rebuild. Crises, for example, a hostage is a crisis for Israel and for the individual being held hostage. It becomes a tragedy when they're executed in the tunnel, as 6 were, and it becomes a remediated crisis when they get out, but there are lingering problems as a result. So you get it? Worries at the bottom, irritants or annoyances, problems, crises, tragedy. Now, Fidelity. I have no problems in my life right now at all. I have no crises or tragedies. I'm very aware that I'm blessed right now. Neither does the fetching Mrs. Hewitt. We've got irritants and annoyances. Fidelity, though, yesterday, 2 days ago, put me into overdrive so that I've been a customer of theirs for 30 years. Until yesterday, I had 6 accounts with them. 2 of them are significant retirement accounts through my employer that I couldn't move if I wanted to. You got to retire when you've been doing those before you can roll them over to someone else, which I will do when I finally retire. Then the fetching Mrs. Hewitt she closed it yesterday, a Roth IRA. Then I had a self-directed investment account that was not significant, but not insubstantial. I used it to keep track of stocks, and it's gone to almost zero value, and I kind of knew that. Then I've got Uniform Gift Act, Minors Act, Uniform Gifts to Minors Act for my youngest son, which we opened up 19 years ago when he was a minor, and I was trying to teach him about investments. And then we had a joint account with my oldest child. And 4 of those, I just don't pay attention to. I pay attention to the 2 significant ones. Fetching Mrs. Hewitt, don't pay attention to. The brokerage account, I know it's got almost nothing in it, but I get their statements, and I am endlessly assaulted by them not assaulted. I am endlessly noticed and annoyed by them by requests that I update this or I update that or I go online and do this and go online and do that. I actually went once to their office in California to try and close all this down, but I didn't have everyone with me. Can't do it. when the kid you opened up a UGMA is not with you. They have to physically be with you once they reach their majority. And the joint one couldn't do it. Fetching Mrs. Hewitt wasn't with me. So I've tried a few times. So I get a letter 2 days ago. Dear Fidelity Investor. By the way, it's sent to my right address in Virginia. Dear Fidelity Investor, we are writing in an attempt to contact you about state unclaimed property laws that could have a significant impact on your Fidelity account. U.S. Post Office has returned mail sent to the address referenced above. Your state unclaimed property laws require that accounts with returned mail be coded as abandoned. All right. What? What do you mean abandoned? I haven't abandoned any property. What state? What law? What are you talking about? There's 6 accounts here. So, of course, they give me a phone number. Call within the next 30 days. All right? A representative will update your account status. There's no need to conduct any transactions or make adjustments to your holdings. That's a threat. That's just a threat. 30 days. Call us. And I am very annoyed at this point. 30-year customer. They got all my information on one screen. They got the right address. They got 2 right addresses. They got a permanent and a temporary. They've got all my Social Security. They know everything about me. Some moron, some automated system sends me a threat letter. So it was a bad day anyway on Wednesday night. We had a tragedy near my home in Virginia. And I get this letter has come, but I wait for the next morning. I call early, get a perfectly professional junior staffer. And I don't want anyone to think I'm saying anything bad about the junior staffer who handled this. She has a script. And if she said, I understand you 10 times, she said it 50 times. She never said, I agree with you. It took 90 minutes for me to close 2 of the 6 accounts. One of which is going to end up after commission, which they offered to waive after they realized I pulled the old trick. Look, I'm a lawyer and I'm a broadcast journalist, and I'm now worried about this process, and I'm going to tell everyone to flee Fidelity. Then they were waiving fees and hold on and all that stuff. I said, no, you charge the commission. You know what that one account's going to come back? I'm going to get a $2 check from Fidelity. I spent 90 minutes on the phone to get a $2 check from Fidelity. They didn't tell me what it was about, or I would say, okay, it's cheated to the state. That's a technical term. And here's what I want you to know. I'm a senior citizen, right? I have all my marbles. I have great hearing. I'm a lawyer, and I'm a good lawyer. And I know what a cheat to the state means, and I know about state property laws and abandoned property. They could have been talking about my significant accounts. I didn't even know what's in this account. So then I tried to close the United UGMA. I can't close it. Then I said, my wife's right here, but she's got to go. Can we do that one? I'll be right back in 2 to 3 minutes. 8 minutes later, my wife has left. They come back on. She can't close it. She called later in the day. Took her 40 minutes to close it. And only after she refused, as I did, to go online. They wanted me to go online and do all that. I don't have to go online. It's my money. You've sent me a threatening letter. Now, here's my worry. 5 years ago, I went to lunch with a then Deputy Associate Attorney General and the head of the elder fraud at the DOJ Criminal Division, because they asked my help in broadcasting the threats to seniors from fraudulent letters and phishing, pig slaughtering, all that kind of stuff. And I kept telling them, I'm a senior, but I got my marbles and I can hear you perfectly well, and I'm a lawyer. Do you realize what you could do with someone? We just found out yesterday we have an acquaintance who has the beginning of early onset dementia. Let's just say, I finally asked this nice junior staffer, do you have parents? How old are they? And the junior staffer said they're in their 60s. He said, well, just think about this letter. It's a threat, isn't it? It's a threat you're going to let my property go. It doesn't name the state laws. I doubt that's true, by the way, that states make you code anything as abandoned property. And I just want you to know, this could scare the daylights out of a senior citizen, and it might lead them to fall for phishing and scams, of which there are many that come in on texts and phone calls. So here's what I'm here to tell you. Get out of Fidelity. Run away from it. It's run by machines now that generate stupid letters that threaten people. I've been their customer for 30 years. They got all my information. The automated Fidelity investments is not worth your time. Run away from them. And make sure your parents do not freak out. And instead, they get very, very belligerent with an irritation, because what is an irritation to me could be a problem or a crisis to a senior who has any kind of disability. And I want you to think about people in your life whom this letter would freak out. Really now with Congressman Dan Crenshaw. Hello, Congressman. How are you?
Hey, doing great, Hugh. Good to be with you.
Great to be with you. You're on the House Intelligence Committee. You're on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. But I want to focus on the former. And I want to lay a baseline down with all my guests, Matt Continetti, Ben Domenech, Jim Talent, Jim Garrity. Does the United States have enemies that wish to do us harm?
Yes. Yes, they do.
And in the order of threat, in the threat matrix, which is the most dangerous that can, hurt us the worst immediately?
Well, I'm not going to categorize. I'm not going to give you probably what most people would, which is a sort of priority 1, 2, 3 list. I think you have to look at threats in the sense of tactical immediate threats and long-term strategic threats. And so your number one tactical immediate threat is the cartels south of our border. They killed tens of thousands of Americans by trafficking fentanyl into our country, and they're pushing Mexico to be on the verge of a failed narco state. So that's a tactical near-term threat. Is it a strategic threat? I mean, in a way, sort of. Mexico is our dear neighbor. But I would say, your number one strategic threat over the long term that we have to be wary of from an economic and military perspective is, of course, China. And really more importantly, that you have to probably group China as the leader of an axis of a counter U.S. global standing with China, Russia, North Korea, Venezuela, Iran. These groups of countries that, for one reason or another, just don't like the idea that the United States doesn't let them just conquer other countries and take their stuff. And that's been the American-led order since World War II, and they don't like that. They would prefer a pre-World War II order where if you're bigger than the guy next to you, you can just punch him in the face and take his wallet. And so that's the sort of posture we face for the next however many years.
Some want to damage us, some want to debilitate us, and a couple would like to destroy us. I'm not sure where the cartels fit. They're not strategically trying to destroy their market, so they're not like China. I think China is our greatest threat, and it's immediate in some respects. They came out with this DeepSeek. I'm sad to say one of my law students downloaded it, so I have failed my law student. How bad is it that it was the most downloaded app in America for a couple of days after they announced it?
Yeah, not surprising. I mean, you get a new AI tool, a lot of people are going to download it. You have to have somebody who's a little bit more familiar with AI than I have. I've seen a couple interesting interviews on this. I mean, China is good at copying us. So instead of being years behind on AI, they became months behind, because a lot of our AI platforms are open source. You can go and copy them and just make them a little bit better for a fraction of the cost. And so we're freaking out because they made it for a fraction of the cost. But keep in mind, that's still off the back of American innovation. It does lend credence to the Donald Trump's idea of this sort of Stargate investment, where he immediately repeals some of the regulations under the Biden administration that were seeking to rein in AI development a little bit, and he immediately did away with those and instead announced investment that would push us forward and beyond China. So between TikTok and things like DeepSeek, I mean, I think it's already been shown, I think I've read about this in the news already, that there's evidence that DeepSeek is indeed being used to take your data, just like TikTok was. They're very good at this kind of Trojan horse thing. Look, Americans, look at this shiny object that you can become addicted to on your phone, and it'll get you. So, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you. When I say strategic and tactical threats, I'm just trying to add a little bit more nuance to the question. Is China? It can be an immediate threat. It could be. Are people dying right this second? Well, yeah, I mean, in a way, indirectly, because they're the ones who provide the precursor chemicals for the fentanyl that comes into our country. So you still have to categorize threats, because by categorizing threats, you develop a better way to counter them, as opposed to just saying, hey, number one, number two, number three. That's not the right way to look at it in my mind.
Well, there's another one, which is Iran and its proxies, and the proxies have been shooting at And it resulted in the death of two of our airmen, not the death, in the destruction of F-18 that caused two of our airmen to eject because they're in a battle zone and they got a friendly fire in a battle zone. Iran is our enemy, and people don't understand this, and the Houthis are shooting at us. Am I correct, Congressman?
Yeah, you're correct. Most people understand Iran. Russia is a bit more of a mixed bag, whether people understand how they're actually an adversary. But Iran, I think more people do understand that. And Iran is acting out of desperation at this point. Israel's done us quite a few favors by dismantling Iran's proxies, namely Hezbollah, Hamas. You've seen what happened in Syria. I mean, Bashar al-Assad was also a proxy of Iran. There's a lot going in our favor when it comes to the battle against Iran, and Trump has a history of being a hawk against Iran. And so I think Iran is on its way down a downward trajectory for sure, and the Houthis have got to be next because, as you said, they are problem children, and they're affecting global trade, which has an effect on U.S. consumers.
And there's finally Russia. Now, I think Russia is a pretty traditional enemy. They've conned some people into thinking they're not our enemy, but I also think they may be our least dangerous enemy because they have the most to lose if we really go hard. But they got nukes. Well, how do you think about Russia, Dan Crenshaw?
Yeah, like you said, long-term adversary. They seem to never want to have the same interests in mind as we do, even though they could. They simply don't. And I think people have to understand that they think like Easterners think. Eastern and Western thinking is simply different. Eastern thinking is based on projections of power. And the Russians have long wanted a security perimeter around them, and that requires them to invade countries. That's why they invade Georgia. That's why they invade Ukraine. That's why they won't stop at Ukraine. And so you either accept a world where dictators just invade other countries, which means you're accepting the pre-World War II world. And I want to remind everybody, you've never lived in the pre-World War II world, but tens of millions of people would die at a time. You didn't have a global economy. You had a pretty crappy life, frankly, for thousands of years. You didn't have modern medicine, modern anything, because it's the post-World War II world where America decided that we would storm the beaches of Normandy and actually make a decision to be the leaders, that we would prevent that. So our interest in Russia is basically making them regret it. And so I support Trump's goal of having some kind of arms disagreement, some kind of agreement with Russia, getting them to the table. They're not just going to come to the table. You've got to escalate to a certain amount in order to get them there. But for American strategic interest for the next 50 years, an American strategic interest is deterrence. We want to deter chaos around us. That's the simple answer.
That's the threat matrix. I'm going to use it with all my guests. I don't want them to necessarily rank it, but I want Americans to get reacquainted with the fact we live in a dangerous world. Dan Crenshaw, thank you very much. American Federal is one of my sponsors. They sponsor the almost close of the market. Look at the market every day, AmericanFederal.com, 1-800-221-7694. They sell you gold, they buy your gold. They sell you silver, they buy your silver. And they do it in a transparent, very straightforward fashion. I bought gold from them in the first week of January, and it's a very easy transaction to do because Nick Rovich and his team been doing it for 40 plus years. No magic, no hocus pocus. What do you want to buy? What do you want to do? And you call them up, 1-800-221-7694. The Dow at this hour is almost down 0.75 of a point. The S&P is off a half point. The NASDAQ down 1/3 of a point. And the 10-year Treasury dropped a little bit, just a touch, down to 4.581. And gold is down today as well, but not by a lot. It's down to $2,827 at this hour. And so if you want that, you call AmericanFederal.com. I like them because when you call 1-800-221-7694, it's not hocus pocus. It's just buying and selling gold with a commission. That's all. Matt Continetti joins me. He's a columnist for the Washington Free Beacon. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's in my ear most days because he's a contributor to the commentary pod. And Matt, I got you for 4 segments or so, so I want to be getting light. Wegmans versus Balducci's.
Oh, Wegmans, absolutely. I mean, Balducci's, I'm a man of the people, Hugh, so Balducci's it's a little bit too elitist for me. Wegmans, that's you go and you can find it everywhere in Red America, and I mean, the prepared food section out of this world. So yeah, Wegmans over Balducci's.
Well, I'm a Balducci's guy because they make sandwiches, and when the fetching Mrs. Hewitt is out of town, they make great sandwiches. I don't know if Wegmans
They
makes
do.
sandwiches. They do. Okay, well, it's closer then. So that's it. Number two. Your column today, in part reads, the document's broad language, the OMB document, resulted in confusion. Democrats stoked the outrage. A federal judge enjoined the order, et cetera, et cetera. You do not mention who the judge is, how long the judge has served, or who appointed her. And do you know any of those things?
I believe it was a liberal judge, but I don't know anymore.
A Joe Biden judge appointed in 2023 who passed by a 51-50 vote, including the vice president. So controversial. She lost a couple of Democrats. I bring this up not because that's relevant. It isn't to me. A federal district court judge, but whenever we read about Judge Eileen Cannon, check me on this, rebuke me if I'm wrong. We always knew she was a Trump judge without many years of experience on the bench, right? Wasn't that always part of the story?
Yes, absolutely. Or if there's a Reagan appointee who rules against Trump, then you'll always hear the Reagan appointee decided that Donald Trump had gone too far this time. But in this case, yes, the identity of the court, of the judge who enjoined the OMB memo, was left out of most coverage. It was in enough coverage that I was able to pull out of my hat, Hugh, that it was a liberal judge, but I didn't know more than that.
Well, the reason I just say that it's so ridiculous. The narrative generators in legacy media always tell you name, age, rank, serial file of the judge when it advances their narrative. And when it doesn't advance their narrative, it's just a judge. And I just think it's absurd and indicts legacy media. Third, not significant thing, then before we get to the significant thing, Emily Wilson's The Odyssey. All right, you guys sold me on this. I love The Odyssey. I was stunned to hear nobody knows what it is. I was stunned by your education statistics. A third of American eighth graders are illiterate. But my eyebrows went up. Christopher Nolan's making the movie. Adam told me about that 2 days ago. I'm very excited because I love The Odyssey. So I went to see Emily Wilson. I wanted to get an audiobook because I listen to audiobook. It's read by Claire Danes. What do you make of that choice?
I think it's an interesting choice. I like Claire Danes' movies. You know, we recently celebrated the anniversary of Igby Goes Down, a movie she made, about 20 some years ago with Kieran Culkin. So I get that. You know, I have not read this Wilson translation of the Odyssey. That was recommended by my colleague and major domo, John Podhoretz. But he says once you get past the very PC introduction, it's a good read. And,
yeah, the Odyssey is gendered. The Odyssey is full of toxic masculinity. Well, the Odyssey is for warriors. There are some women, Penelope, the sirens, the witch, for whom a woman's voice would be right. But don't you think the Odyssey ought to be read by a man?
Yeah. You know, Homer was a man, of course, and he's the one who recited it to begin with. I guess there's some historical continuity. But, you know, I guess maybe it's because I'm a squish shoe. I'm always open to creative interpretation, so I'm going to let this one slip by.
I didn't buy the book. I was prepared to buy the book, and I like Claire Danes, but I said, no, the Odyssey should be read in the voice of Odysseus or Ulysses. Matt, I just had Dan Crenshaw on. I'm going to ask you this question. I'm going to ask Ben Domenech, Jim Talent, Jim Garrity. Who are America's enemies? And by that I mean an enemy wants to destroy you, disable you, debilitate you, or in some way damage you. Who are our enemies, and who are the most important enemies, the most threatening enemies?
Sure. Well, unfortunately, we have many enemies. You look at the openly adversarial regimes. The Islamic Republic of Iran views us as the big Satan ever since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. It's pursuing nuclear weapons. It has caused chaos throughout its region and beyond. It's currently organizing plots to assassinate U.S. officials, including President Trump. The other adversarial regime is the People's Republic of North Korea. Now, we have a ceasefire in place in the war since 1953, but that war in which many Americans died has not actually concluded. And the DPRK as well has nuclear weapons, and is now attempting to create an ICBM that could reach the continental United States. Then there's the terrorist threat from ISIS and Al Qaeda and the various radical Islamic militants. And then you kind of have the competitors, the great power competitors, Hugh, our adversaries. The most powerful is the People's Republic of China. And then I also believe Vladimir Putin's Russia is antagonistic toward America and American interests and values. So that's kind of the landscape. And there are smaller powers, Maduro in Venezuela, the remnants of the Castro regime in Cuba. But I'd say that the big ones are Iran, North Korea, and then China and Russia.
All right, now, Congressman Crenshaw used everyone on your list. He said we can't categorize them number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 because there's a threat matrix. I get that, but I'm trying to drive home. China is our number one enemy. And this DeepSeek thing was a complete, you called it an information operation. That's exactly what it was. But those of us who are old enough to remember the Soviets know what that is. And one of my law students actually had downloaded it before I could stop them. And I said, what? Hello, spy, come into my house. And they don't get it. But Dan Crenshaw also added the cartels. And Donald Trump's imposing tariffs on Mexico and Canada and China, in part because of the cartels, in part because of fentanyl and immigration. I think he is right to use tariffs under his commander-in-chief power. We have a minute to break. What do you think? I think he has tariff power under his commander-in-chief power. We have 30 seconds till we go back on. What do you think?
Yeah, tariffs for national security do fall under his powers, and he's using his tariffs as leverage in order to force Mexico and Canada to crack down on fentanyl traffic and illegal migration. So it's an appropriate use of his power. And the cartels are an enemy of the United States, especially now that they've been designated as terrorist organizations by the Trump administration.
Now, we had a terrible tragedy in Washington, D.C., and that is not the action of an enemy. It is an incompetent action either by the pilot of the American Airlines, the pilot of the Black Hawk, or the air traffic control tower. One or all of those three, we won't know. We'll find out soon. But I want to point out, Americans are never our enemies. We can be in deep disagreement with them, but they are never our enemies unless they're treasonous sons of guns like Edward Snowden. That's an enemy. When you become a traitor to the United States, then you're an enemy. But the bollards in New Orleans that weren't fixed, the fire hydrants that went dry, and something that went wrong in the skies over Reagan National. There is a theory of brokenness which is gaining traction in my head, that the government is just broken. What do you think?
Well, these examples of government incompetence seem to be increasing. I mean, whether it is the situation in New Orleans prior to the terrorist attack on New Year's Day, or we're discussing the poor fire management policies and water policies and just general climate of DEI and wokery in Los Angeles prior to the wildfires. And now we have this terrible accident above the Potomac River with the civilian airliner and the Black Hawk helicopter. The competence is important. And this is why I think it's completely appropriate for President Trump to raise the issue of merit and whether we are hiring the best people for these various positions. Obviously, there's a whole lot to be discovered about what happened in Washington the other night. And there's a lot of painful emotions that people are going to have to work through as we continue to recover and identify the victims of this accident. But we also need to make sure that we have competent individuals, the best people. I think that makes sense. And if you don't have that, then you are going to have kind of a culture where things just slide. And that's what we don't want that in the United States of America. We're better than that.
And that goes in the category of difficulties we have as a result of politics that do not make the people who created them our enemy. In another category, we got this weird story where the Vermont border guard was murdered by apparently a trans activist terrorist in league with other trans activist terrorists. There are enemies within, but they're few and far between, right? It's not the 60s. We haven't got a weather underground We don't have a lot. I get we have Antifa and thing like that. Those are enemies of the public order. But I don't rank them on the level with China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, Venezuela, the cartels. Do you?
No, I mean the external threats are greater. I mean, and I named those rogue states or in those great powers at the top of my list, Hugh, simply because they have access to the ultimate weapon. There is no greater threat than nuclear weapons, and the terrorist groups, of course, would love to have nuclear weapons as well, and that's why I kind of put them at a higher level. But there is an internal threat as well. Sometimes that's the cartels, a transnational threat, but then you also have to worry about lawlessness in the society. You have to maintain and exercise the rule of law and order in a society, unless you're going to have just, again, things slide, chaos and anarchy and murder. And I am troubled by a rise in political violence that I have to say there are examples on both sides, but
Yes.
there are quite a few examples on the left. There are more examples coming from the left recently than there are from the right. And when you consider as well the pro-Hamas sympathizers, the actions that they are taking on America's streets and on America's campuses, that is a threat. That's
they're enemies.
Not just a threat to
they're
Jewish
enemies.
students. That's a threat of us all. This story that you're talking about in Vermont, and let's just also recall the reaction to Luigi Mangioni's terrorist killing of the United Health CEO. And so I am slightly disturbed, especially when I look at survey data showing that younger Americans believe that Mangioni's murderous act was justified. That is something we have to worry about, as well as the national security threats that emanate from outside the United States.
So now the harder question is, what do we worry about the most? I went through the Hugh Hewitt hierarchy of trouble earlier in the program. There is anxiety and worry, and that really doesn't matter very much. Then there are problems, health issues, but not of the next category, crises, and then there are tragedies, which cannot be reversed. But in the hierarchy of trouble, China is our biggest adversary. I have behind my shoulder Tom Cotton's new book, 7 Things You Can't Say About China. They are a malevolent, evil actor on the world stage. And I don't know that Americans kind of get that, because I didn't even get it until 2014, until I figured out Xi is not Deng or not the previous two dictators. He's really a Leninist. He's really a bad guy. Do you think America understands that?
I don't think that we fully understand it, Hugh. I think we're beginning to understand it. I think the Special Committee on China was a beginning of people recognizing it. I do think the law forcing the sale of TikTok was another sign that people recognize what China is up to, especially in the tech space. I think at the level of military readiness, we're beginning to recognize that we have to expand the Navy. We have to reinvigorate our defense industrial base if we're going to keep up with China. And the way I see it, just briefly, is the way to strengthen ourselves in relation to these enemies, in relation to a great power competitor like the People's Republic of China, is to strengthen our home. That's why we need energy dominance. That's why we need to release the animal spirits in our economy. That's why we need to do everything we can with light touch regulation to promote technological innovation. Everything that grows from that is going to strengthen America's natural advantages, which we already have, and lead to innovation that will translate into a qualitative military edge. So I start with our energy sources, and then I think you use those to build out a strong economy, a strong military, and technology that the enemy cannot match.
Matt, I'm always smiling when you at the Commentary Podcast give props to Doug Burgum. I've only met him once, 2.5, 3-hour dinner with Michael Waltz, which at that time they didn't know they'd be working together. And I learned more about carbon capture, energy production, AI, small modular reactors in 2 hours from Doug Burgum than I had learned in my 67 years. I think he's fabulous and is key to this whole thing. What do you think?
Oh, I love the guy. As you know, if you listen to the Commentary Podcast,
but I don't know if it's because of the merch or the guy. You love the merch.
No. For me, it's the guy, because you talk about what you learned about small modular reactions from Governor Burgum. I learned about city planning and road building and highways and urban development. And then in another conversation, I learned more about drug policy and addiction than I had before.
Really?
I think he should just have a position. I'm glad he's on the National Security Council, Hugh, but I also think he should just have like kind of a swivel chair near President Trump so that whenever Trump has a question about something, and he enjoys Doug Burgum's company because Burgum campaigned with him quite a bit in 2024. You get so much insight. And so it's very important that he be on the National Security Council as they pursue this strategy of energy dominance, leading eventually to America's furthering our qualitative military edge. And I also think that his counterpart, the incoming Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, will only amplify the insight into energy markets, into how to extract the most from our natural resources. Also, the way that we tackle permitting, Hugh, so that we can strengthen the grid. It's one thing to create the power, but you also then have to move it, right? And liberals and environmentalists, of course, want to prevent that from happening. So these are two great picks by President Trump. And I think that they're actually at the center of the strategy to pursue a new American golden age, because you cannot have an economy, you cannot have civilization without bountiful, cheap energy. And one more point. Our enemies, as we started this discussion, often they sit on energy resources. And they use those resources to manipulate world affairs in their malign direction.
You're absolutely right,
best
Matt.
Way,
energy is
to undercut
freedom.
Russia.
Yeah.
Is cheap energy.
Russia's Saudi Arabia with trees. And the fact of the matter is, energy is freedom. Matt Continetti, always great to talk to you on a Friday. Have a wonderful weekend. In a week of tragedy, there's also a strategic loss. I'll talk to you about that. Let me give you some good news first. I'm going to get Governor Bill Lee on next week because they adopted a much broader school choice program, not universal school choice. 20,000 of Tennessee school children get school choice. And that costs about $500 million. And it's a start. And our friends at Job Creators Network, sponsor of our program, are in this business of pushing school choice everywhere. Visit their website, educationfreedomusa.com. And I'm going to get Governor Leon next week. I'm already talking with his comms team to find out, okay, 20,000 this year, how many next year? Because the only place that does universally is Arizona, as far as I know. Ohio's pretty big. Iowa's pretty big. Florida's pretty big. West Virginia's pretty good. There are other states that have varieties of school choice. But educationfreedomusa.com is the scorecard. And our friends at Job Creators Network and our friends at the American Legislative Exchange Council, everybody who's on the right side of thinking is for choice and competition in education. educationfreedomusa.com. Go and get on board and help. Go and get things moving in the right direction. Because that was a big win this week in Tennessee. I want to make sure I'm just not a prophet of doom. Big loss this week, DeepSeek. If you downloaded it, remove it immediately. Maybe too late. You might have to get a new phone. It's just incredible to me. Charles C.W. Cook did this on National Review, the guy on the editor's podcast. The guys at Commentary amplified it. I want to amplify it more. DeepSeek is a Trojan horse, in my view, unless proven otherwise. I don't believe anything that comes out of the Chi-Coms unless it's completely transparent, and this isn't. Type in Tiananmen Square. I don't want you to type it in. I will simply tell you what has been reported off of neutral computers. People download it onto a computer. They don't care if it's got malware on it. And and that should not be you, by the way. Every computer that you've got is probably connected to your other computer. DeepSeek, in the terms and conditions, says we are recording your keystrokes. We are taking your keystrokes. So all your passwords, all your financial accounts, everything. If you get DeepSeek, you're inviting the Chi-Coms into your house to take everything and remember everything. Get rid of it. But please be aware, the Chinese Communist Party is our enemy. They are Leninist. Xi is a ferocious, tough customer. Doesn't mean we can't beat him. We had ferocious, tough customers in Stalin and Khrushchev and Brezhnev. and especially in Ropov, and we beat them. Takes a long time. You got to be smart. We can win. But don't help them. Don't give them all the stuff about yourself. All right, just get rid of DeepSeek. Lose it. And tell your kids. TikTok is evil. DeepSeek is evil. There are people who want to spy on you and remember everything about you and steal your stuff. And some of them are Chinese Communist. Dominich joins me, as he does most Fridays. Ben is the editor-at-large of The Spectator. You can follow him on X at @bdominich. He's a Fox News contributor. He's also the host of the Ben Dominich podcast, which I recommend to you heartily. Good Friday to you, Ben. How are you?
I'm doing well, Hugh, and obviously this was a week when there's plenty to talk about. So what do you got first on the docket?
Well, first on the docket, I want to talk about the crisis, the tragedy of the week in D.C., but in the same context of the bollards that did not work in New Orleans, the fire hydrants that did not work in Los Angeles, and the education system, the report card of which is truly horrifying for our eighth graders who are not literate. Do these things have something in common? The crash in the skies above Reagan National, the school dysfunction, the fire hydrants, and the bollards, do they all have something in common?
From my perspective, they certainly do. One is, of course, that these are things that are entrusted to our government that have failed the people who rely on them for their safety, security, and when they are tested, when they are actually having to live up to their obligation to the American citizenry, they are time and again found to be actually not up to the task. They fail. These systems sometimes fail because of human error, and these systems sometimes fail because of more fundamental problems that ought to be addressed. And in the case of this most recent failure, we had clear warning signs repeatedly of the degree to which the lack of sufficient air traffic control staffing across the country was leading to a number of different problems and so-called near misses that had been happening at airports, even to the tune of having one of these same near misses requiring another go-round happening just the previous night at Reagan National. And Hugh, based on where you lived when here in Old Town Alexandria, my home office faces in the direction of the route that these planes take all day. I see them coming in, and to see something like this happen, which, by the way, the crash ultimately took place directly in front of the apartment building where my parents live. It was just an astounding thing to have happen, and really is an indictment, I think, of a number of different things. Even if it ends up being something that they have tended to dismiss as a human error, perhaps as the pilot of the helicopter in question, I think there are more fundamental questions about how much the airline system in particular has failed to adapt in the wake of the pandemic, when they fired so many people, put so many things on freeze, and then ultimately had so many people retire that they have been behind the eight ball when it comes to both pilots, air traffic control, everything else that we require for a system that is stressed already and has been experiencing much higher levels of usage in the wake of the pandemic.
Yeah, I'm a citizen of Virginia, and I live most of the year under the flight path of DCA. I'm astonished because it's the most tightly constricted and most observed, highly sensitive flight corridor in America after 9/11. And therefore, I don't know if it's the American Airlines pilot, the Black Hawk helicopter pilot, or the air traffic controller, or all three. I don't know. I bet you the president knows more than all the reporters, though. And so I'm not going to criticize his remarks yesterday. I'm going to hope that Sean Duffy gets us details, because people want to know what caused this, because they want to know their measure of alarm when they fly. So they got to get out there and tell in a hurry what happened. Do you think they will?
I think they will, and I think that one of the reasons is, and this is unfortunate, it's because of that proximity to power that I think we will know the truth. The simple fact is that there are too many congressmen and senators who fly in and out of that airport with regularity, including Jim Justice flying back and forth every day, on his own jet, by the way, from West Virginia, that you have too much interest there, too much demand for answers for those not to come through. But also just that everyone in this community is hit by this. In the local establishment where I go not infrequently to have a drink, Hugh, I went in the other day and discovered that one of the regulars, a fellow who I don't know all that well, but enough to say hello to, had lost both his wife and daughter.
Oh my gosh!
Plane crash, and it's just the kind of thing where you have so many connections in this community that you are 1 degree or you're 2 degrees away from someone who has experienced something related to this, and it's something that is just jarring because we don't think that things like this can happen in the nation's capital anymore. We assume that there's more expertise at play and that they would not, play at dice around so many important institutions, people, and places, especially in the wake of the lessons of 24 years ago. And that's something that I think, unfortunately, we were disabused of. And the one thing that I do hope that comes out of this is more recognition of what needs to be done to ensure American security, whether they are senators or congressmen or they are just citizens of this nation. When it comes to air travel, it's very important. We have one of the safest systems in the world, but it can still be better. And whatever needs to be done to achieve that, I hope that the president, and I'm sure that Sean Duffy, will be committed to trying to do it.
Typically, worries about liability have prohibited the government from running in, and liability be damned. One of my old partners, Tim, was an aircraft disaster plaintiff's lawyer. I'm retired. He's retired. We're not looking for business. But they always find out after years and years where the human error was. But sometimes it takes years and years because people don't want to pay the bill to those victims that in that bar and to the 67 families who have a airtight case against somebody or many people. Did you know, Ben, I learned this from the Commentary podcast this morning, that we still don't know why the Francis Scott Key Bridge collision happened a year ago? We still do not have an answer?
In fact, I do. In fact, I was simply I was talking about this as happenstance just a couple of weeks ago with a friend of mine who recently bought a house in Baltimore, and she brought it up to me, and it was just one of these things where I was saying, I guess I lost it in the sea of all the things that we do not know, like the motives of the Las Vegas shooter. And
that's my first. That's the number one thing. How about the bollards not being repaired in New Orleans? Somebody decided not, and the empty reservoir in Pacific Palisades, somebody said, take the cover off, drain the reservoir. We never find out.
It's absolutely heinous that we don't. And look, Hugh, you know the way that this played out during the pandemic. They wanted to play hide the ball with everything. And look, I mean, even more recently, look at the situation regarding drones and the way that the Biden administration talked about that. And then we get the very first press conference from this administration. Caroline Leavitt comes out and she says, actually, the president told me that, that I can tell you this. These were all FAA approved flights. There were some hobbyists as well. But, in terms of the mass, panic that emerged in New Jersey, you could have had more clarification. And yet, time and again, and, sometimes for reasons that they believe are justified, sometimes simply because they think that it's better to keep the public in the dark on this because of ramifications that we don't always understand. The government does not put itself in a position where it increases in our trust. And that's something that needs to change with this new administration. And it's one where, look, at the end of the day, I think we're going to have more confidence in Sean Duffy at the Department of Transportation than we ever did in Pete Buttigieg. But that's also not saying a lot.
So a very low bar. What about the near illiteracy of a third of our 8th graders? Now, that's a systemic problem. It's one that is crippling, even in the medium term, and I know why it exists, but are we going to do anything about it? I mean, Tennessee yesterday voted a school choice program for 20,000 of its students. That's, I don't know how many of that is. Better than none, but not as good as everyone. What do you think? Are we going to fix public education?
Look, I know that we are so overdue on this, but so much of the plight of the American working class, and I don't want to, put Vivek Ramaswamy on the spot, but he did this interview with Andrew Schultz, which I commend to you to check out, where the comedian Andrew Schultz was going pretty aggressively at him, basically saying, that you have endorsed the idea that Americans are too mentally defective to compete with those who would come from overseas. To me, that's an argument that a lot of Americans, far too many of us, just accept as being the natural state of things. And it's not. It's an indictment of the failure of our public education system. And look, we cannot continue to endure as a great nation if we have a situation of true segregation between those who can meet the basic task of literacy and those who cannot, even if we throw more and more money into these systems that have only proven that they can get more expensive as they get worse and worse when it comes to every measure of failure. It's not acceptable, Hugh. It has to be changed. And look, I know that this administration has so much on its plate. There's so many things it's going to try to do. But this has to be a major priority in terms of turning the ship around, because otherwise this crew of children who are coming out, especially those who had to live through the pandemic and live with those screens for so long, they're going to be set behind for the rest of their lives.
Who are America's greatest enemies? And by enemies, I mean those who would diminish us, those who would damage us, those who would displace us, those who would destroy us. I got answers from the congressman and from Matt, Ben. Who are our greatest enemies?
Well, I'm tempted to ask if either of them got cute with it.
No, they went right at it. But I'll say Ben Crenshaw. He's not a golfer. Congressman Crenshaw, Dan Crenshaw, said a threat matrix isn't ranked order, Hugh. You got to be aware that some are immediate.
Right. Well, here's what I say. Let's evaluate this in terms of immediacy and in terms of the longer perspective. In immediacy, I would say the greatest threat that we have is that we have a failed narco state on our southern border that has for too long gotten away with far too much and been the pathway for much worse than what emerges from within it.
That was the first on the bingo card of Ben Crenshaw, the cartels.
Okay, look, I just think in terms of immediacy, that is the biggest threat. In terms of the overall scope, quite obviously it is not, because if you had the will to do what needs to be done in terms of establishing a true America First foreign policy for the Western Hemisphere that understands the need for us to have a true renewal of the Monroe Doctrine and to understand what our immediate obligations are to our citizens, including those who are experienced, I do not exaggerate when I say regular invasion from these cartels into American property and territory along that southern border, then we would be able to do it, I believe, forcefully, quickly, and effectively. In the longer term, there is no question that our biggest foe in the world is the Chinese Communist Party and its octopus-like tentacles that go out across the world in ways that I think this administration and the first Trump administration understood to a greater degree than any other, in my lifetime, which is to say that they understand that the hopes and dreams of the 1990s as it related to China did not come to fruition. They may have been well-meaning, but they did not turn out the way that we would have hoped. And instead, what we have, is a nation state that is bent on our destruction, not just as another power, but as a people.
Yeah, not our displacement, not been damaging us, destroying us. By the way, They had a tactical win this week with DeepSeek. One of my law students, a good one, a curious one, had downloaded it. And I said, "Are you out of your mind? That's hello, spy, come into my house." And I think I shamed everyone into getting rid of it. But 30 seconds, Ben, that was a win for them.
It was a win for them, and it's also, this is the other thing. It's their wins tend to come as a surprise for our marketplaces and for our leaders in ways that continues to disturb me. That they do things that they do not expect, or that they are quicker to come to conclusions and keep them hidden for far too long. And I'm sure there are people who knew something like this was coming, but even some of the top minds in this space did not know it and seemed to be taken by surprise when
and head faked everyone into making it the #1 app downloaded from the Apple Store. Ben Domenech on the bingo card of enemies. The other ones listed were Iran and its proxies, Russia, North Korea, and various terrorist groups like ISIS and the guy in New Orleans on New Year's Day. So,
can I add something?
Yeah.
I would like to add a little place to your bingo card called Hollywood.
Okay, that's a complicated subject. But go ahead, tell me why.
It's a complicated subject, but let me just give this case for you. I believe that if we are going to be about an America First ideal, one that extends beyond the current presidency to something that is a longer-term goal. And I was thinking about this in the context recently of
Captain America,
a mini documentary about Andrew Breitbart.
Oh, okay.
The need for cultural restoration is paramount in this moment. Look at the Oscar nominees and look at how insignificant they are culturally.
They're crazy.
They're insane. I also think it's absolutely hilarious that a movie like Amelia Perez, which is unwatchable, would get 13 different nominations, tying films like Mary Poppins and classics.
Virtue signaling at its worst.
It is terrible, and it's just terrible as both art and terrible. It would be terrible even without the politics. But my point is more this: America should once again become the cultural exporter to the world that people used to know it as, meaning that this is the place where people want to come in order to create content that flows throughout the world, influences people in ways they don't even fully understand, and is admired throughout the world for what it can achieve. And instead, we have gone in a completely different direction in recent years, and we're going to continue to go that way.
Let me add, Captain America, whatever its subtitle is, the new one. It's an anti-American movie with an actor who did anti-American things. I'm not going. I hope no one goes. I hope it crashes because until Disney learns.
It also, they even had to edit it because it was even worse, apparently, in terms of being even more anti-American the first time it was tested with audiences, and they hated it. So my point is this. I believe that the cultural supremacy of America is deeply important for the future of the world in the West. That in order to get back to that point where we make the best music, we make the best movies, we have the best culture in terms of what people aspire to, I think that losing that is incredibly important, and it sets up a situation where others will fill in the void and take our place, and they will be places that do not have our values, do not have our shared ideals, and are opposed ultimately to the freedom of humanity. And that's something that I think is deeply and critically dangerous, and something that we need to understand and evaluate as being just as important on certain levels as all the other of the threats that you
Hollywood
mentioned.
are full of morons, and the box office will tell them to stop. But I want to go back to Iran. Iran's proxy is shooting at our sailors. And last year, their proxy killed our soldiers in Jordan, and they're attacking our ally, Israel. They're actually the most immediate tactical threat to our warriors. I think that's true. Do you agree?
Yes, I would agree. I mean, if you could say that what we see from Mexico and the failed narco state there is the immediate threat to our citizens.
Yes.
I would say that. But to our warriors, yes, you are correct.
All right. Then we've got Russia, North Korea, and I want to spend some time. And obviously various terrorists, including the wacky terrorist that killed the Vermont border guard, including the terrorist in New Orleans, including remnants of ISIS that might be in Syria. I want to focus on Russia and North Korea because they are actually partnered up now, and Norks are going into the front lines in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. I think they're our enemy. They're the one that we are most likely to be able to deal with in a kind of Nixon to China moment. Do you agree or disagree with that?
How would that play out, Hugh? I mean, I could see what you're getting at there, but in terms of your anticipation of how that would play out, what do you think would be the leverage point or the way that this administration would tackle
oil prices? And it's because we have no leverage over China. They're too big. And we have no leverage over Iran. It's a theocracy, and it's a maniac theocracy. So if I'm trying to figure out who to deal with to try and split up.
So it's simply the point of leverage as it relates to energy and oil that we would be able to I mean, I am willing to consider that argument. I think that that's probably correct. The truth is that, from my perspective, the Iranian problem is one of the most difficult because it's such an insane regime.
They're theocrats.
It doesn't respond to the same signals the way that others can. And that's something that I think is going to be a continual problem for us. I'm not sure that this administration is going to, given everything that they've got on their plate, do anything but get us to a better point of stasis as it relates to that.
Oh, well, it's a one-day problem. As Ehud Barak used to say, I think he yelled at W. It'd take you one day, and that the strategic threat would be removed in one day. We don't want to go to war. We're not sending troops abroad again. I'm not a neocon, or what anti-neocons think a neocon is, which is endless wars for the benefit of the industrial war complex. It's nonsense, but I'm just a Reagan conservative. You can do a lot in a day in Iran to set them back.
I think that one of the things that we need to think about going forward here is just given the level to which we face so many different challenges, prioritizing what can be done and done effectively with the tools that we have at hand right now, and then setting us up to have better tools in the future is really what I think this administration needs to be about.
And so I got a quick exit. We've got Rubio, Burgum, who's on the National Security Council now, Hegseth, and Waltz. I think they're the equal of any group of national security people we've had in a long time.
I agree, and I can't wait to see what Waltz does in particular, because I think he's bringing a combination of a stiff spine and an awareness of the problems that has long been lacking in that role. So,
he's a warrior. He's a Green Beret. He's been in the field of fire in Afghanistan. He's shot the enemy. He's been shot at by the enemy. He's lost friends, and he's really smart.
Yeah, look, I think we have a generation now who's been through a level of experience that, frankly, prior generations that served during the 90s, during the post-Gulf War era, didn't really get. And that's something that I think is going to serve them well in these jobs. And look, I again, give credit to the president for the fact that he has put a number of people in these jobs who don't necessarily have the same opinions, don't necessarily fall along the same lines, but have advantages, and I think have already shown themselves to be capable communicators and very studied in terms of what they understand about what's gone on in the world in recent years.
Now, Ben, I have a quick exit question. If you want to expand on it, you have to stay into the segment in between.
I got to go after this and make dinner. Sorry.
Is Edward Snowden a traitor?
I don't believe that Edward Snowden would categorize as a traitor, only because I like to think of traitors as people who I think should be executed. I don't think that necessarily of Edward Snowden. I do think that he's a criminal, and I would like to see him rot in jail for the rest of his life. However, I will also say that this whole idea that he was, not a traitor, I think was dependent on him remaining in America. And the moment that he chose to go and flee to Russia, I think that became much more of a discussion.
Yeah, he went from being a leaker to a traitor when he skipped out to Russia. In my book, in Hugh Hewitt's book.
In your book, yes.
You've got a different book. Ben Domenech, thank you. Follow him on X at B Domenech. Listen to his podcast, The Ben Domenech Show. Thank you, Ben. Senator Jim Talent, formerly senator from Missouri. He is now the Reagan Institute chairman at the National Leadership Council. Jim, I don't know where to begin, so I'm just going to begin with the same question I asked to Dan Crenshaw. Who are America's most dangerous enemies?
China, because it's the most capable. The problem in Asia, and it's actually a global problem, is China's the rising hegemon. We're the status quo hegemon. And the two countries define their vital national interests in ways that are mutually exclusive. So the Chinese want to control their strategic environment. And as a matter of fact, they claim sovereignty, as you know, over the East and the South China Sea, and they want to exclude American influence. They want to control American activities. They also have global ambitions, which are antithetical to ours. So, for example, if they get what they want, they will say to us and other countries things like, well, the Vietnamese market's ours. You can't trade with them. You can't have an alliance with Japan. You can't sail commercial vessels, much less military vessels, through the East and South China Sea without our permission. Well, this is obviously intolerable to us because we define our vital national interests as defense of the homeland and the ability of Americans to move, trade, and travel in the world on the same terms as everybody else. So there is inevitably conflict between the two countries. You call it competition, conflict, a Cold War. And we're going to have this for some time. And they're the biggest threat because they're the most capable of all the threats that are out there.
And they had a big win this week with DeepSeek, not because it represents a technological breakthrough. That's facts, not in evidence, because they conned a bunch of Americans into downloading it, and it's just spyware. It's malware, I think. But when I say enemy, I mean foreign powers that want to damage, debilitate, displace, or even destroy us. Congressman Crenshaw led with cartels because they're killing Americans right now. Matt Continetti led with Iran because they're crazy fanatics, and everyone's got the same list of threats, and it's kind of. But you did what I would do, which is immediately, let's go to the top of the food chain. We fix China or deter China. We're in much better shape with everybody else, are we not?
Well, it's the hardest. It's the hardest one to deal with. Now, remember, we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. So we have to deal with the cartels. We have to protect our interests and our security in the Middle East. We have to stabilize Eastern Europe. We're a great nation. That was the point of Donald Trump's inauguration speech, and we can do all these things. But China is attacking us or attempting to weaken us across a number of domains. So military is one, using their economic power, throwing their weight around it is another, and also the tools of sharp power, espionage, gaining control of nodes of influence in the United States, and collecting information about the American people so that they can use them for all kinds of nefarious ends. TikTok is one example and DeepSeek is another. And so we have to be prepared to contest them across all these domains. And that's why Senator, the first Trump administration.
When you and I were lads, we knew that the Soviet Union were the baddies. You know, Boris Badenov and Natasha on Bullwinkle. I mean, it was in the water. And we would never have downloaded an app from the Soviet Union. I don't think our young people know that now. Do you?
No. And in part, this is a failure of political leadership. Now, the first Trump administration dragged us into the 21st century as far as China was concerned. For most of the 30 years before that, we had actually been facilitating their rise. Now, I want to be fair.
Yes.
The Obama administration did have the pivot to China in the 2011-12 timeframe. So what Trump did had its roots in some of the things Obama was doing. President Trump also began reforming and rebuilding our national security architecture to give us the tools we need to deal effectively with China. And I think you're going to see that on steroids in the second administration. It's everything from, yes, the tariffs, sanctions, export controls, rebuilding the Navy, cyber. And now what I do have questions about is whether the administration will effectively use the American narrative against China. That's one of the things I think Marco Rubio.
Yeah, I think Waltz, Rubio, Pete Hegseth to some extent, but really Doug Burgum knows how to make this sell. Jim, over the last few years, culminating in the crash of the Black Hawk and the American Airlines, and we don't know who's responsible for that yet. But it goes back to the boat hitting the Francis Scott Key Bridge. It goes to the fire hydrants not working and the reservoir being dry in Pacific Palisades. It goes to the bollards being down in New Orleans. It goes to our eighth graders scoring the worst they've ever scored on literacy. There's systemic failure in the government at every level. Does anyone not recognize this?
No, I think they do. I think the problem is intensified in many of our, not all, but many of our major urban areas. And, Noah Rothman's written a lot about this. As a matter of fact, I think he's talked a little bit about it on the show, that one of the challenges is when the progressive establishment adopts as its major objectives these utopian goals. We're going to change the climate. We're going to eliminate any disparities in outcome among different ethnic or minority groups. We're going to change the way we view human beings so that there's more than two sexes. So one of the evils of that is that it's impossible and it leads to all kinds of negative results like not producing energy. But another downside of it is that they don't pay attention to the basic provision of public services, whether it's air traffic control or whether it's fire prevention or managing dams or levees or the rest of it. Now, I'm not trying to just lay it all on them, but these are the centers. I mean, these are the areas that are not functioning, that are having the most difficulty functioning. And we need a new wave of mayors and governors in blue states and red states, like we had in the 90s. And you'll recall, we had some mayors take over and really turn these cities around. We did it from the Congress in the District of Columbia in the 90s when we created a financial control board and worked with the Clinton administration and turned that city around. So the Trump administration's emphasis on excellence and competence is very timely and very needed.
It's a perfect way to end it. Excellence and competence at every level of government, especially on those matters. At the local level, it's the police. At the state level, it's disasters. At the federal level, it's the military, air traffic control, and probably Food and Drug Administration. But there are many things. Jim Talent can be found on X at Jim Talent. You can also hear him on Dwayne's World weekly, and he's here every week as well. Thank you, Jim. I'm joined by Garrity, the indispensable. He is, of course, the author of The Morning Jolt for National Review, columnist for The Washington Post. And this week he was on not only Three Martini Lunch, but he was also on the Editors, and one of the most important podcasts I've heard in a long time, because boy, did they take deep seek to the woodshed, and necessarily so. Hello, Jim. Thank you for an excellent podcast with your colleagues at the National Review. I've been banging on. It's just, hey, hello, spy, come into my house, listen to everything I do, and track all my keystrokes. What morons downloaded it?
We learned nothing from TikTok, Hugh. Mankind will learn at the altar of experience and at no other. It's a famous statement, and now apparently not even at that one. I also want to point out, Hugh, this is a very special episode. It is the end of January, and I have finally transitioned from forgetting to be online at the right time for Monday morning appearances to now forgetting to be online for Friday afternoon appearances with you. So I really feel like I'm now on the new schedule. And the desperate text from Dwayne, "Are you there, Jim?" Now it's, now we're back to normal. Now I feel
all
like
right, Jim,
I've gotten into the rhythm of things.
I had a long list. I've talked to Dan Crenshaw, Matt Continetti, Ben Domenech, Jim Talent about enemies of America, both foreign and domestic. And the enemy we have at home is incompetence, whether in the skies over the Potomac in that tragedy, fire hydrants that don't work, reservoirs that aren't filled, boats that run into bridges, schools that don't work. Those are not real enemies. They're just incompetent. Then we got China, Iran, the cartels, Russia, North Korea. What should we worry about first?
It's very hard to pick one or the other. I think your point about DeepSeek, and we should point out that this was a huge breaking over the weekend, the hot story on Monday. As the week went on, you saw more skepticism, and Andy McCarthy wrote about this at great length. Just earlier today, there were new reports saying that if you look at the cost, it was not $6 million. Their estimates, one portion of the testing was $6 million.
Oh, Jim, you mean the Chinese are lying to us?
Right, I know. Those of us, those of us who covered COVID would be shocked to find this. By the way, this is a separate AI program, but there was an AI program that Chinese researchers in a university put in charge of a satellite, and apparently on its own, it started looking for military sites of hostile states. So, Hugh, guess which city that those researchers were operating in?
Silicon Valley, San Francisco?
No. Guess which city the Chinese researchers were operating in?
Wuhan.
You got it.
I did not know.
When the single most advanced nuclear submarine, the newest one in the Chinese fleet, sank at the dock and was flooded, and they don't think they had a radiation leak, but they may have. Kind of hard to tell. The whole thing was covered up by the Chinese military. Hey, Hugh, guess which city that dock was in?
Gonna take a wild guess and say Wuhan.
You got it. All problems of the world trace back to Wuhan, China. It is the hellmouth. It is where I exaggerate slightly, and I should point out that Wuhan is a fairly large city, so it is a little. It's just that most of us hadn't heard of it before COVID-19.
What would be the equivalent in the United States? Is it like Houston? Houston's close to the water. They got chemicals. They got a lot of people.
If I say Cleveland, you're going to say it's the greatest city in China.
Well, that is.
It's large, but the interesting thing, it's not Beijing, it's not Shanghai, it's not Hong Kong, it's not close to the sea. It's actually kind of inland. So, so there's that factor. Yeah, sure. We'll go with that one. I also noticed that Catherine Levitt said from the podium that COVID-19 came from a lab leak.
Caroline
I know
Levitt,
the
yes.
Central
Caroline
Intelligence
Levitt.
Agency had made the statement. Yeah, Levitt. So FBI had made that assessment. The Livermore Labs at Department of Energy had made that assessment. It's nice to hear it coming straight from the podium. My
You
question
made that
now
assessment
is, okay, great.
in January of 2020. So did I, and Tom Cotton announced it as an official of the United States government on this program in January of 2020. It wasn't news.
Okay. April 4th of 2020 was the first really big, thing that I wrote. And remember, March 12th is when March 13th is when the world shut down. But I point this out. Great. I am glad that maybe a pangolin kissed a bat, as to paraphrase Jon Stewart. I'm glad that the natural origin theory is largely getting dispelled or ignored.
You're not allowed to recycle your National Review bits on the Hugh Hewitt show, because I've heard that one before on the editors.
All right, thank you. Yeah. Well, not everyone who listens to your podcast and your show listens to the editors. So
they should.
But anyway, also I'm environmentally conscious, Hugh. That's why I recycle my jokes. But a bit more seriously, what are we going to do about it? What do we want to do as a matter of policy that it is an appropriate consequence for COVID? Never mind, like the first thing, stop downloading Chinese-made apps, including like the 2 users at the Pentagon. Like, is there any, that is one where I look at that.
It boggles the mind. Boggles the mind. So here's my suggestion. Exit the WHO and don't look back, and exit everything else that China's a part of, because they corrupt everything they touch.
That may require something. The leaving of the World Health Organization. I've heard the objection. Oh, well, if we leave it, that means the Chinese have even more influence. Look, the World Health Organization, a couple weeks into COVID, looked at it, wanted to declare a pandemic, and the Chinese said, no, don't do that. And the World Health Organization decided, okay. And another month went by, and then they said, okay, yes, it is a pandemic. If that's the way the organization operates, it no longer has any value. It is now an extension of the Chinese government. The whole point of having a World Health Organization is to come out and warn us about, hey, the largest, global pandemic threat, something that ultimately killed 7 million people according to the official count. You throw in all the totally unrelated death increases in deaths in places like Russia and China and Iran and places like that. You get up to numbers closer to 25 million.
Okay, now, let me give you something to chew on until next week. Arm Taiwan with nukes, and don't tell China that we did so until after they're fully installed and they know what to do with them.
I think, if you problem is you got to keep that real quiet until it's all done. If any point early in the process, you've got a whole world of trouble.
I'm just saying, if you really want to say thank you for killing 25 million people, Taiwan has nuclear hypersonic missiles, and they can launch from tubes and you can't stop them. Deterrence is reestablished. Jim Garrity. Follow him at Jim Garrity. Read, of course, the Morning Jolt-ers Washington Post columns, and get the 3 Martini Lunch and the editors. I have to announce a major breakthrough for new media. The Ruthless podcast stormed the ramparts of the White House Correspondents Association today, and Michael Duncan, who was on this program yesterday, one of the 4 fellows from the Ruthless podcast, was the first occupant of the new media seat at the White House. Here is Caroline Levitt from the podium. Oh, first I got to do Joe. I thought Tarzana Joe was later. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Hugh. How are you?
Good. I've lost track of my calendar today.
That's all right. I've done that too. When a tragedy happens like the one in Washington, it reverberates throughout the country, in this case, throughout the world. But when it's a community that's lost so many of their members, sometimes those ripples go deeper and are longer. We living things all pay a price. We live our lives upon thin ice. And in some ways, we shouldn't forget our tricks performed without a net. No matter how adept or agile, every breath and step is fragile. So go ahead and give your all. Get up every time you fall. Train and strain and work and try. Your coach will wait to kiss or cry. And even if you're just a klutz, go on. Try that double Lutz. We know not for what fate we're waiting. Let's spend our time together skating. That's All Quiet Along the Potomac by
And very
Tarzana Joe.
poignant, Joe. It's been a year of tragedy already. Fires and terrorism on New Year's Eve, followed by fires in California, followed by the air disaster. It's just not what you like to rhyme about.
You know,
But that's poignant.
Tarzana Joey is volunteering with Team Rubicon,
Ah,
and he has seen things that he doesn't even want to repeat. He's been filling sandbags in Malibu and carrying stuff around. And
good for Tarzana Joey. And good for you. TarzanaJoe@Reagan.com for your poetry needs. And that Quiet on the Potomac is available at TarzanaJoe.com. Write him at TarzanaJoe@Reagan.com.